involved in politics. He'd be accused of violating the separation of church and state. He'd be accused of forcing your views on other people, and those are false arguments. Those are arguments used by our opponents to prevent us from participating. They're used to marginalize us. They want to marginalize the Christian population to enhance their own influence. But in Alberta's past, there was a very strong Christian influence in Alberta politics, more so than probably any province in Canada. And this can be shown because of the fact that we had two premiers who were radio evangelists. They weren't radio evangelists who became premiers. They were radio evangelists and premiers at the exact same time. They were premiers during the day and evangelists during the night. Now, the first of these was William Aberhart. His nickname was Bible Bill Aberhart. He was called Bible Bill because he was famous for his Bible teaching before he became a premier. He was actually originally born in Ontario. He became a teacher and then a principal there. Then the Calgary Board of Education hired him in 1910 to come to Calgary to be a to be a principal. And he became the principal of Crescent Heights High School in Calgary. So his full-time job at the time was to be principal of a high school. Then he started teaching Bible study at Westbourne Baptist Church. His Bible study became more and more popular. More and more people were coming to his Bible study. He became a lay preacher there at Westbourne Baptist Church. Then in 1925, because his Bible teaching was so popular, he created a radio broadcast in Calgary from CFCN. It's called Back to the Bible Broadcast. And I have to appreciate in 1925, radio was the new technology. People were just getting radios. There was no television, no internet. Radio was the big thing, and people were getting radios and listening to radio. And Bible Bill Aberhart was one of the most popular radio programs in Alberta. He got tens of thousands of listeners in a province that had a population of about 700,000. He became very well known as a radio preacher. His Bible studies and his popularity with his radio audience became bigger and bigger. So in 1927, he founded the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute to be a Bible college in Calgary. So it was a Bible college, but also held worship services there, and he did Bible studies there, and his radio broadcast was from the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute. So again, he had a huge radio audience in Alberta and into parts of Saskatchewan and BC. Then of course the Great Depression happened about 1929-1930. As a principal, he saw the effect of the Depression upon his students and their families, and he felt bad for their suffering. He was looking for a solution. What's the solution to the Great Depression? And he came upon the economic theory of social credit. Now, social credit is not an easy theory to explain. It's not a socialistic philosophy. It believed in private property and free enterprise, but it believed that credit should be controlled for the benefit of the people and not by private banks for private interests. So basically, in effect, the idea of social credit was for the government to issue credit rather than private banks issuing credit. Anyway, he really saw that he believed that this was the solution for the Great Depression. So with his vast radio audience, he promoted the idea of social credit right around Alberta with this radio audience. He was already very well respected and very well known, and so people believed that indeed that William Aberhart had found the solution to the Depression. So a social credit party was founded, and in 1935 there was a provincial election where the social credit party won an overwhelming election victory, and William Bible Bill Aberhart became Alberta's premier. That was 1935. He remained as premier until 1943 when he died. So Aberhart's influence on Alberta, there was two big influences. One, through the radio audience, through his radio program, he brought the gospel into almost every home in Alberta. So even people who weren't going to church, they hear the gospel on the radio. So that was one of his big influences. The other one was the formation of the Social Credit Party, because the Social Credit Party would change Alberta for decades. It became the dominant political force in Alberta for generations, actually. So when he died in 1943, the premier that replaced him was Ernest Manning. Ernest Manning was a Saskatchewan farm boy who became a Christian by listening to William Aberhart on the radio. He heard William Aberhart's radio program in Saskatchewan, and he believed he became a Christian. He was just a teenager at that time. So when William Aberhart formed the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute in 1927, Ernest Manning moved to Calgary to become a student there. He was actually the first graduate of the Prophetic Bible Institute in 1930. Ernest Manning was a very capable person. He distinguished himself at the Bible Institute. He became Aberhart's right-hand man, and Aberhart was his mentor. So when in the 1935 election, Ernest Manning also ran, and he won a seat as an MLA, became a cabinet minister. He was only 27 years old, so he was one of the youngest cabinet ministers in the British Empire at that time. We're actually one of the youngest cabinet ministers. So Ernest Manning replaced Aberhart as premier. He not only replaced him as a premier, he also replaced him as the head of Aberhart's ministry. So he became the radio evangelist for what was called then Canada's National Back to the Bible Hour. So he was premier and a radio preacher. He also expanded the national Back to the Bible Hour across Canada. So by 1951, he was preaching on 14 stations across Canada with a reported audience of about 1 million people. So at that time, Canada's population was about 14 million, and the reported audience for Ernest Manning across Canada was 1 million. So you can think of people in Ontario once a week would hear Alberta's premier preaching the gospel to them on the radio. So when Manning resigned in 1968, he was the second longest serving premier in Canada's history. There was one premier in Nova Scotia who served longer than him, but still Ernest Manning is the second longest serving premier in Canadian history, and he won 7 consecutive provincial elections. He never lost an election as premier or in any other capacity. So after he resigned in 1968, he retired. In 1970, he was appointed to the Senate, and he was a senator for 13 years, from 1970 to 1983. And all that time as premier, and all that time as senator, he was the radio preacher for Canada's National Back to the Bible Hour. And actually, even after he retired in 1983 as senator, he continued preaching on the radio until 1989. Now, he died in 1996. And there was no one who questioned his honesty or his integrity, like not even his opponents. He was very renowned for his honesty and integrity for anybody who knew him. Now, during the 1960s, well, this was one of the periods, I guess the 1960s was one of the periods of social credit dominance. And of course, there were some critics of social credit in different parts of Canada because of the Christian influence. In the 1960s, here in Edmonton, there was a journal called Edge that was published by a University of Alberta professor that was critical of social credit. In one particular issue from 1964, there was an article by a PhD student criticizing social credit. I just want to read a couple of sentences from that to get the idea of what social credit rule was like in the 1960s. And this guy wrote, quote, "To speak of politics in Alberta is almost a misnomer. There is little serious opposition to the social creditors who are entrenched in a monolithic system of theocracy." So even in the 1960s, people criticized, Ernest Manning and his government for theocracy. But it's interesting here, this is a critic, and he says there's little serious opposition to the social creditors. So why would there be little serious opposition to them? Because they were popular. They were popular in Alberta. They won all these elections, often with landslide majorities. So other people in Canada might have thought it was strange to have a radio evangelist premier, but it wasn't strange for Alberta. Year after year, election after election, he got elected one time after another. So, it might be a little bit exaggerated to say Alberta was a theocracy. It is exaggerated to say that, but nevertheless, that's kind of the impression that some people have. And one of the great legacies of Ernest Manning was the development of Alberta's oil sands. He was one of the 2 people most responsible for the development of Alberta's oil sands. Ernest Manning, who was Premier of Alberta, and a man named Howard Pugh, who was the president of Sun Oil Company. They were both evangelical Christians, and it was their relationship together that helped to get Alberta's oil sands developed. In the 1920s, there were attempts began to see if the oil sands could be developed commercially, but time after time it failed. And it didn't look, for many people, it looked like the oil sands were not going to be beneficial to Alberta. But Ernest Manning was confident that the oil sands could benefit Alberta, and so he continued to look for investors who would invest in and develop the oil sands. And he found Howard Pugh. As I mentioned, they were both Christians, and even Ernest Manning at the time was known a little bit in the United States. Of course, in Canada, he was known as a radio evangelist, but he had spoken on behalf of Billy Graham, and he'd also written for a magazine that Billy Graham had founded, so he had a bit of a name in the United States. And Howard Pugh, the president of Sun Oil Company, had a nickname. He was called for a while God's bankroller, because as a wealthy person, he would give lots of money to Christian causes. So these were the 2 men that would work together on the development of oil sands. So in 1962, Howard Pugh committed $250 million to the development of the oil sands. He founded the Great Canadian Oil Sands Company, and it started building in 1964. So even though Ernest Manning and Howard Pugh were friends, they were evangelical Christians, and they were working the oil sands, they didn't agree on everything. They had to negotiate how the oil sands development would occur, because of course Ernest Manning wanted what was best for Alberta, Howard Pugh wanted what was best for Sun Oil. So they did have some differences, but they had a common friend who would act as mediator, and that common friend was Billy Graham. So Billy Graham mediated between the 2 so they could get a final agreement. And the Great Canadian Oil Sands plant was opened in 1967, and Ernest Manning and Howard Pugh were both there. And now we know Great Canadian Oil Sands as Suncor, because it was Sun Oil Company, and when they did some kind of rearrangement there, they switched name and made it Suncor. But the point is that Ernest Manning played a very key role in the development of oil sands, and we as Albertans continue to benefit today from the work work that Ernest Manning did back then. So just to Ernest Manning, he left such a good name. The Manning name was old in Alberta. So when Preston Manning began forming the Reform Party in the 1980s, there was already a base of support for him because of the Manning name. So nowadays, of course, as I mentioned, Christian influence in Canada is frowned upon. But don't let the arguments that I mentioned allow the other side to marginalize you. We as Christians have every single right that any single citizen in Canada has. We can get involved. No one can tell us otherwise. We have every right to bring our beliefs and values into political activity because we are equal citizens to everybody else.
Right on. Thank you, Mike.